This is threat actor of in-Tur-est, Unveiling Balkan targeting. And we're going to be talking about a investigation into a threat actor that we did, the attribution, the assessment, and the activities that we saw. So a little bit about me. I'm Jack Simpson. I've been in PwC for 4 years, focusing in the Euro region, mostly focusing on Russia-based threat actors. A little bit from a personal life. I'm a West Ham fan. Some call it soccer, some call it football. I nearly cried watching the Euro finals. And also I'm a big fan of Goose Island IPAs. I will be covering the technical side of this talk, and I'm going to hand over to Louise to talk about herself.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. So I'm Louise. I lead our Euro research desk, and as Scott gave in the introduction, I do focus in particular on the strategic side of house in our analysis. My background is in Eastern European languages and politics. Like Jack, I'm also a bit of a football/soccer fan, but somewhat unfortunately, my team are very much underperformers compared to the team that Jack supports. So we'll gloss over that one quite briefly. In today's session, I'm going to be following Jack with a bit of an overview of some of the geopolitical landscape against which we've been seeing White Tur operate. So without further ado, Jack, I will hand back over to you.
Cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the very start of the investigation. So, on the 29th of January 2021, I observed the domain qov.rs. RS is the top level domain for Serbia. And what we observed was a phishing page. When looking at the HTML source code, we observed that HTTrack software copier or website copier had been used to copy a website, and it had been modified by a threat actor for phishing purposes. It also shows the date. So we were able to identify one sort of where this came from. So as you can see, that's highlighted on one of the pictures, we can see this was trying to phish the Ministry of Defense of Serbia, but we also saw the date and the difference between the domain registration and the copying of this website. Now, there's a lot of unrelated threat actors that use this, so this isn't a really interesting data point. But from at the start of the investigation, we need to build up a lot of information about this particular threat actor, because when looking at it from the start, we hadn't seen something like this from a threat actor that we currently track, and so we were trying to get as much information to see if we could really drill down into that. So a lot of legitimate users also use this software, so it isn't just used by threat actors. We saw this domain being published on social media. So on Twitter, a security researcher put qov.rs and talked about how this was a phishing page. And within a couple of hours, the threat actor stopped the domain resolving to an IP. Now, of course, we just heard a talk from Cyber Reason about attribution and not, of course, jump into conclusions. And that was something, it could be a coincidence. We don't know too much about this threat actor. We're coming in fresh. So we've really got to look at it. But we've got to remember that piece of information as well, because that, that's interesting to us, because the phishing page was online for 2 weeks. So it wasn't a small amount of time. And this threat actor could feel, it's too risky to have some of that information on social media, and so they'd prefer it to be dropped. So with that, when we found additional infrastructure and started looking at this, we started to think about giving this threat actor a new name, like many people in the industry do. And we gave this threat actor name White Tur. The reasoning for white is that it's, to us, we've given it an unknown origin, and Tur, in our naming convention, we give a mythological creature in the second word. There's also other colors like blue, which is a Russia-based threat actor, and red, which is China-based. So when looking at finding additional infrastructure, what we did is we went on that qov.rs and we looked at it, what it was resolving to, so what IPs it was resolving to. We found a number of other domains, which, going through them and trying to identify them, as an analyst, you're trying to see if there's any similarities in registration data, in themes. And what we found was a lot of these domains that were shared with each other were related to or had themes of Serbia and Republika Srpska. Now, on your right, you can see a Multigo graph. If you haven't seen a Multigo graph before, it's perfectly fine. What we're showing here is that there's some form of cluster. We can see the blue are domains, and there are orange circles there, which are IPs, and these are all interconnected. The main reasoning I'm trying to show this is that there are some threat actors that like to compartmentalize their infrastructure. So they'll have one domain to one IP, and then another domain to a different IP. In this particular instance, this threat actor found comfortable that they would have one domain resolving to one IP, and that IP had a number of other domains which we assessed was likely their activity. So we've got a number of those domains on our screen. And after doing some research, we started to really pull back some of the consistent themes that we saw from this threat actor. So we've got the malicious domain sejam.us, which is a malicious domain spoofing sejam.rs. Sejam.rs is an exhibition center in Serbia. And when we looked at the registration data of the malicious domain, we observed that actually this exhibition data was hosting a defense fair around the same time, giving us more information for us to identify this threat actor a little bit more. We also saw a telecommunications company being spoofed, MTEL, and we also saw vladarrs.co spoofing vladarrs.net, which is the Republika Srpska official government domain. So after all of this, finding this infrastructure, there's one thing for me as a threat analyst, a question that I have, and that is, was it a pen test? Because it's very easy to jump into conclusions of espionage, crime motivated, but the very first question I have to think about is, was this an organization trying to simulate a threat actor that's an APT or a crime motivated threat actor, or is this actually something that I want to track and look at? So with that question in mind, we observed from the vladarrs.co domain a blog post from the official Republika Srpska website, and they had a blog post referencing this domain, and they were describing how they had emails in April 2020, which is a little bit further back from our investigation, and they discussed how this email, don't click on these links, don't click on the attachments, this is spoofing us, you shouldn't be doing this. And so we started to think and put an assessment that it's unlikely a government would report on a penetration test and release these indicators of compromise. It's certainly possible still, but from our assessments, it's unlikely. So we looked a little bit further into this vladarrs.co domain, and we observed a archive, and it was hosted on a URL, which is in the pink box down below, and it had a unique ID 5611. So we observed this zip archive. We knew that it was hosted on a domain of interest, and we also had a blog post referencing this, and it, them talking about the maliciousness of this domain. So then we had to sort of confirm what if we could connect those two things together, and we did. So what you've got there is a link that we assess as an outbound link from the official Republika Srpska government and their webmail, and it's redirecting to that specific ID URL, which is in the red. And the reasoning here is that we're not just seeing it hosted on the vladarrs.co domain, we're actually seeing it where it's actually got the redirection as well. So in that file, in that archive was a HTA script, and that once you execute that HTA script, you observe a message like this, and it's got COVID-19 themes, much like a lot of threat actors in April 2020 at the height of the pandemic. And what it's doing in the background is it's loading PowerShell code to finally execute a certain payload. But what was really interesting for us when looking at this, of course, is signaturing opportunities and looking and trying to identify what we can do to further track this threat actor. So what I found interesting was this particular background color. So when looking at that background color, using it and signaturing it, the specific value 3961A2, we're able to observe additional samples from the threat actor and allowed us to identify additional infrastructure, additional weaponized documents simply from looking at that background color. Now, when it was loading that PowerShell code, it did it from a different domain, dropbox-online.pro. And what is really interesting, what I'm trying to drive down is the argument as well of the interconnectedness of their infrastructure from when we kept looking at their different parts of activity. So as we can see, there's vladarrs.co. At some point that was resolving to the IP 94.156.189.122. And again, dropbox-online.pro was also resolving at some point to that IP as well. Some threat actors don't like hosting the payloads and communicating in the same IP. In this particular threat actor's case, they don't mind it. So after identifying multiple samples and seeing a number of pieces of infrastructure, weaponized documents and malware, we started to identify some patterns, as you should as a threat analyst. And we started to identify handles. And we can see here Tenshow, there was a folder for infrastructure, there was a portable debug path using Tenshow. Atterox was referenced in weaponized documents by White Tur because they use an unregistered version of Sublime Text, but they also had Atterox available in portable debug path. So again, we use these handles, particularly Tenshow, Shads, and Atterox, as opportunities to signature with other things that were previously observed by the threat actor, and it allowed us to further build the picture of what this threat actor is about. With that intelligence, we identified a number of themes, and as a threat analyst, I'm just going to identify two that really struck with me when looking at this particular threat actor, and that is the ammunition factory and ammunition identification technology. I have not observed that from a threat actor in my personal experience, and so that really struck with me looking at this threat actor. So then when we looked at defense and government targeting, we saw a document lure being used with some malware, and the document lure had a particular date on it. When looking at that and observing the malware metadata, we actually saw that the threat actor took about 1 to 6 days for a turnover from the document lure to actually converting it with the actual malware and packaging it, which gave us more insight and understanding about this threat actor and how quick they sometimes can be. We also saw this threat actor compromise a legitimate website, which strengthened our argument about it not being a penetration test. And we observed a number of things: weaponized documents, PowerShell code, C2 pages, and we also observed a victim log. So what we did when we looked at this particular victim log, we saw a single line, which is on your screen now. And it had an IP that was based in Republika Srpska, so again, strengthening the Serbia and Republika Srpska of interest. And we assessed this was a victim. And, there's a number of people that might say, oh, it could be the operator. But looking at our intelligence and looking at, our assessment, we took the decision that this was likely a victim. So then looking at the infection chain, we've talked about the HTA script and how it loaded PowerShell code. I want to talk about the PowerShell code a little bit because it can be of interest with this particular threat actor, White Tur. So they use WMI objects to be able to identify parts of the environment, not too dissimilar to a lot of threat actors. So they wanted to know about what antiviruses were there, what the domain name was, what the computer name was. And then they used the bits transfer PowerShell module to be able to communicate that to a C2 and give that information before they execute the next payload, which would be an LNK file. The reason for highlighting the bits transfer PowerShell module, because a lot of threat actors use that in PowerShell, is that they also use it in their Windows binary backdoor. So some of the problems that you face as a threat analyst is sometimes in an infection chain, you're not getting to the final part. And in that particular case, we got a HTA script, the PowerShell code. In that particular point, we didn't get the LNK file. But in this case, when looking further into the samples and getting the signaturing, I then did identify a backdoor and a full infection chain. So we saw a weaponized document as the initial infection vector, then an XSL file, then an LNK file, and then a JScript loader, which led to a JScript payload. Now, JScript should not be confused with JavaScript. It's one of the interpreted languages used in Windows script hosts. A lot of people know it as WScript, and it's similar to VBScript, if that helps. And this particular JScript loader showed that the threat actor had some thoughts when it came down to evading static analysis. They decided to encrypt their payload using RC4, and it required a key that was an MD5 hash. And when looking at these infection chains, we started to see common things, common uses of the infection chain, and we saw XSL files commonly being used to execute the JScript payload. It was a popular choice by White Tur. So we took that, and another data point, that they've got a preference towards that. The JScript payload has very simple functionality. So it had execute commands, it had sleep, and a default response. And so what I've done here is I've got some of the command lines as a picture there just to help people sort of visualize what it looks like. So then with that sort of signaturing opportunity of the JScript, we also observed a Windows backdoor from the threat actor with very simple commands. Again, similar: execute command, sleep, and default response. And so what I've done is I've given some Wireshark goodness to the right. We've got a example of who am I with the execute command. And one of the reasons why I'm sort of highlighting the execute command is that there was a really good indicator of compromise when it came down to this specific variant of the Windows malware, is that it piped the execution of the command into a static file, which is in the example command box. It read that and then sent it over. So if you had, looked at the victim, you would be able to identify it because they used a static file to pipe the result of their commands. So with that, we found a really interesting case that sort of put some doubt into me whether I'd got it correct. We observed an open source project, Open Hardware Monitor. We observed that within an archive, and we saw White Tur's backdoor in it, but it wasn't in the public project. It was just a sample that I observed, and I started to really doubt with my analysis whether I'd got anything this correct, because it looked really strange how this was sort of presented. When I went deeper into the Visual Studio project of Open Hardware Monitor in this archive, I saw that they'd added a pre-build event. And as you can see, you might see some similarities to the PowerShell code that was in the previous slide. And they were essentially doing the same concept. They were loading the PowerShell code through this pre-build event to execute a payload. Now, this technique had been used by Zinc. Many know them as Lazarus. We track them as Black Artemis. This is an unrelated threat actor, but this technique was reported by Microsoft, and this was around a similar time frame to what this threat actor White Tur was doing. So they finally, at some point during this process, it would execute the Windows binary backdoor command.dat, which is the last part, the payload. And when looking at that, we observed some really strange links. It had a digital signature, and the digital signature name was star-artov. When looking at, pivoting off that and looking into different samples, we observed TrickBot. We track them as White Magician. They had samples related to this. We saw Parallax Rat samples, which are mostly crime motivated with this digital signature name. And we also observed some unidentified samples which looked crime motivated. And this gave us some doubt whether we'd got this correct. There's a lot of mess here. And we had to look back a little bit and try to understand what had gone on here. And from our assessment, what we identified is that this command.dat file is likely White Tur. They're using the Tenshow handle, which I've got there, the portable debug path, but also that it's likely that White Tur used an underground crime service to acquire a digital signature for this malware, and many other threat actors used it, and therefore this digital signature was shared. So then we moved to other crime links, which confused me and made it really difficult to try and understand the motivations of this particular threat actor, White Tur. We saw an espionage CV sample, which is to the left, and we saw an invoice theme sample, which we suspected was a crime motivated sample. In their metadata, they had the exact same author metadata, very similar loader URL, but then looking at the submissions of these particular files, we saw some consistency with the White Tur sample, with Serbia submission, and then with the suspected crime sample, we saw the US and Japan. So very different, very out there. The sample size of all of this was very small as well. So it's really difficult for us to truly understand what's going on. And also the crime motivated sample was on a domain we assessed was also crime motivated. We didn't know where the White Tur CV sample was hosted, or if it was used, how it was given to a victim. And so it's really difficult for us to make this assessment. And there's, when you're investigating a threat actor you don't think you currently track, you're trying to identify the motivations and different patterns. And in this particular case, the sample size is too small for us to truly understand this particular case, whether this the threat actor is using sometimes espionage and sometimes crime, or whether it is using these crime themes to look like it's doing crime, but it's an espionage, or another hypothesis. So then one of my final points that I'm going to talk about is something I commonly see with threat actors when you're looking at them. This is from a conference paper about a China-based threat actor, and they had re-registered a domain that had previously been White Tur's. And if you hadn't seen all of the nuance of what I just talked about, all of the different signaturing and all of the different patterns that were just observed, and just looked at the infrastructure, you would have thought about linking these two threat actors with each other. And in that case, it isn't. It's just that the threat actor had re-registered that particular domain. The last point I want to talk about is attribution phases. In Timo Steffen's book about attributing threat actors, he talks about the 4C model and attributing threat actors. from what we've done and what we're looking at with White Tur, we think that we're at the technical clustering phase currently when looking at the 4C model. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Louise to talk a little bit more about the strategic side.
Thank you, Jack. So absolutely, as Jack's touched on there, we have seen some challenges when it comes to attribution around White Tur and what's driving their activity. Jack's touched on there, like possible fluidity around links to criminal activity, possibly espionage motivated. As I'm sure a lot of us are aware on this call, that concrete attribution can be very difficult. I didn't bring my crystal ball with me today, unfortunately. In this particular case, when it comes to White Tur, we have seen it's targeting in particular the defence sector. It has a very specific focus on a particular part of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. There's possibly an espionage link there. So potentially it could be easy for us to jump to conclusions, but we are intelligence analysts, so we have to challenge these assumptions and make sure we're examining all of the evidence that we have to hand. So for the next few minutes, we'll take a little bit of a step back and look at the wider strategic context around which some of this activity is happening. As we've seen, White Tur's targeting has primarily focused on entities in Serbia and in Republika Srpska. So that's in a part of the world called the Balkans, which is in Southeast Europe. You can see on the map there. I think just at the outset, it's important to flag that, in very recent memory, actually, the collapse of Yugoslavia did precipitate a violent conflict that was driven by a variety of factors such as language, borders, religion, identity, and actually a lot of these factors still actually shape the region today. So this is a very complex part of the world. I will try to be as respectful as possible to some of these sensitivities as we walk through the next few minutes. So Serbia, hopefully, is going to pop up on my, oh, there we go. Oh no, I went too fast. Oh no, sorry. This is where it all falls down. Here we go. Okay, so back to Serbia, there we go. So Serbia and its neighbour Montenegro actually formed what ended up being the rump of the old Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Montenegro gained independence from Serbia back in 2006, and that really kind of marked the last remnant of what had been the federal Yugoslavia, which had disintegrated over the course of a number of years of conflict. Republika Srpska, however, is possibly a name that's a little bit less familiar to some of you, and it is actually a more complicated situation as well. So there are two federal entities that make up Bosnia-Herzegovina. So we have the majority ethnic Serbian Republika Srpska, and then there's also the Bosniak Croat Federation as well. And this structure actually came about as a result of the Dayton Agreement, which was established back in 1995, and that was in the aftermath of the Bosnian conflict. And that agreement, it stipulates actually very specific power sharing arrangements between those two entities, which ensures that there is fair ethnic representation. So with that context in mind, when it comes to geography, we can then begin to think a little bit about why the defence sector in particular might be of particular interest to White Tur as a threat actor. So within the Serbian economy, actually the defence sector is a very key strategic area. The Serbian defence industry is the largest in the Western Balkans. It consists of around 200 companies or so, and tends to be largely dominated by state-owned arms manufacturers. And interestingly, actually, Serbia overtook Croatia as the largest regional military spender in 2019. For Republika Srpska, slightly different. So there were significant reforms pushed through in 2003, aimed at establishing a unified armed forces command. So the country does actually have a joint armed forces across both of those entities that I flagged. And actually, as a little bit of an aside at this point, it's maybe interesting to note that back in 2003, it was actually reported in open source that the then president of Republika Srpska dissolved the military intelligence office. That followed reports that the office had been operating intelligence collection campaigns targeting NATO and other international officials in the region. So we can now begin to sort of examine some of those vested interests in the sector in this part of the world, and that can really begin to help to inform some of our wider attribution analysis. So Jack, as we've seen, he's been looking at the kind of the how and the what of this activity associated with White Tur. A strategic perspective can help us understand the why a little bit more. And again, as I've said, we want to avoid these analytical biases. So at this stage, I think it is important we do take a broader view of the geopolitical context to begin to consider why a threat actor, perhaps motivated by nation state interests, could potentially be conducting this type of activity. So firstly, as I've said, Republika Srpska does actually form a constituent entity within Bosnia-Herzegovina. Relations between the central government in Sarajevo and the Republika Srpska administration are a little bit on the tense side sometimes. So the president of Republika Srpska has previously threatened to actually withdraw from state level institutions and actually announced in October of last year, so just a few months ago, that Republika Srpska would actually be looking to take over the military facilities that are currently managed by the Bosnian Armed Forces. Moving on, so Kosovo actually has an over 90% ethnic Albanian population, and it declared unilateral independence from Serbia back in 2008. However, it is actually still home to a very sizable Serbian minority in the north of the country, and a lot of that community don't currently recognise Kosovo independence. So tensions between those two communities do tend to run fairly high. So there is still actually a NATO-led peacekeeping mission known as KFOR, which is deployed to the area. And actually, as an example of this, in September of last year, there was a dispute over vehicle registration between Serbia and Kosovo, and that led to a border blockade. There were reports of special police forces being deployed and also military aircraft patrols as well. Slightly further afield, primarily due to its position with regard to Kosovo and other interests, Serbia has been open to cooperating with other international partners. So Serbia tends to be Russia's closest ally in the Balkans region. And this relationship does actually extend into the military and defence space as well. So Serbia, for example, hosted joint military exercises in October of last year. And Russia's also a key military supplier of hardware. So that's included helicopters, tanks, and fighter jets, which have been sold to Serbia. Again, slightly further afield, so Serbia's actually sought to position itself as something of a strategic hub for China, acting as a bit of a conduit for trade across Southeast and Central Europe. This collaboration is a little bit less developed in the defence space, although Serbia has actually purchased surface-to-air missiles from China. And notably, actually, in 2020, so a couple of years ago now, Serbia received a shipment of Chinese drones, and that was actually China's first export of military aviation equipment into Europe. So we can see there that Serbia has also provided China with a bit of an opportunity to establish a foothold in the European defence market. And then last but not least, on our whistle-stop tour, so Serbia's relationship with the West, which for the most part is through NATO and the EU, it is largely cordial. So Serbia doesn't have a specific interest in joining NATO, but it is a member of NATO's Partnership for Peace programme. And Serbian forces have cooperated with the NATO-led KFOR deployment, which I mentioned previously, including, for example, performing joint patrols. Unlike its position on NATO, Belgrade is actually pursuing membership of the EU, which is one of its key trading partners. Progress towards accession has been a little bit stalled. The EU does actually facilitate dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, but there are a few kind of technical issues which kind of hinder progress towards its accession. So with all of that in mind, where are we left? So as you've seen, we haven't attributed White Tur to a specific originating geography yet, but hopefully that geopolitical explanation I've given you at a fairly high level does begin to highlight some of those complex interests that we will be taking into consideration as our analysis and attribution analysis progresses. Also, just to flag that if this presentation from Jack and I wasn't enough, we actually have a sister technical blog which has been published today. That includes additional technical analysis and indicators which complement obviously Jack's portion of this presentation. We do, being very high tech, actually have a QR code which links directly to the blog. That's on the next slide, which we'll put up. And also when you look through our slides, there is a technical appendix as well at the end of this. So next steps, so from the strategic side, I will be keeping an eye on the political situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina and also in the wider region as well. And of course, I'll continue to liaise with Jack on tracking further targeting, assessing the implications of that activity, and our attribution analysis will be an ongoing process as well. So Jack, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up with some questions?
Yeah, so I'm just really interested to see how they react to this presentation, or if there's a change in tradecraft, or what sort of reaction is done after this. So we saw previously with the security researcher on Twitter and that being dropped immediately. I'd like to see how that goes.
So here we go, there's the QR code. I think we maybe have a couple of minutes if there are any questions. Otherwise, Jack and I will be hanging out in our hallway for the next half hour. So if anybody has any other questions, I'd like to pick up there as well. And also a big thank you to everybody for organising it. This has been, so far, it's been brilliant. And also a big thank you to Scott as well for being our warm-up act and also our mentor team.